Thanks very much, Wayne. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is the story of the transformation of a political theory professor into an amateur curator who is presented with all the problems and the vexing troubles that you have been discussing in the last 2 days. So the question is, how did that happen? Before I get to that moment, though, how did it happen? How did this transformation take place? I need to give you a sense of how could it happen? What is in the nature of the work that that political theorist did that led to the calls from the communities of performativity to reflect on what they are doing and eventually work together in a collaborative mode. That might sound a little bit abstract, but it's going to make more and more sense when I articulate this notion of performative citizenship that we have been developing over the last 15 years. Now, when we use the term citizenship, the concept citizenship, inevitably, without our volition or will, or even intentionality, we invoke a paradox. This paradox is partly because citizenship has a particular history as a strategy of government that divides. It's a biopolitical technology that divides people into groups, insiders, outsiders, creates new forms of inclusions, exclusions, and it creates notions of us and them. For citizenship to be able to function, it needs to create these divisions through which it works. In a way, citizenship is a play of domination. It is about domination that creates these divisions. Yet, on the other hand, citizenship also has a history of a means of empowerment. It enables people, historically, particularly in the last 200 years, but it has longer history than that as well. It enables people both claim and make rights for themselves and others as an art of living together. It creates patterns of emancipation. It brings, every time we use the term then, it brings both of these functions into play, and inevitably there's a tension between these two, a paradoxical situation for anyone who uses the term and wants to signify it one way or the other. So anyone who uses the concept then has to come to terms with paradox that one inherits when uses it. Now, I'm not going to say much about particularly the first phase of citizenship, which Jim Tully calls civil citizenship. This is the kind of citizenship that constitutionalizes, institutionalizes, legalizes citizenship so that it can play these functions of division, us and them, others, and so on. Rather, I want to focus particularly what we have been doing over the last 16 years, 15 years, that Jim Tully also called a civic notion of citizenship. Civic in the sense that these are negotiated practices that enable people to make certain claims for rights. Now, I call these, studying these two types of citizenships, keeping always the other one in view as conventional and critical approach to citizenship. Now, I'm going to say a few things about conventional ways of thinking about citizenship, but my primary focus will be performative citizenship, which I consider a critical way of approaching citizenship. Now, I consider a performative citizenship in this critical sense to include 5 senses of citizenship. It is about signifying citizenship. So we are not necessarily describing citizenship as it exists, but we are signifying or perhaps even resignifying citizenship. How we resignify it, we bring various senses to it. And to me, there are 5 senses that are quite crucial. These are distinct but overlapping senses. First one is that we need to recognize, or we do recognize, that citizenship involves political and social struggles over who may and may not act as a subject of rights. It has that divisive element. But the key question is about not necessarily people as such, but their acts. Who may act or may not act as a citizen? So it is a conduct on conduct, limiting the ways in which people can conduct themselves. It is about deeds and maintaining a control over who can do under the name of citizenship. Second one, if it is in fact these are political and social struggles, these struggles feature not only citizens but also non-citizens as relational actors. Every time that we think of citizenship performatively, we have to think about the actors who are brought into play in the game of citizenship. And it always involves those who are going to be considered as non-citizens. This is not only a game that citizens play. It also brings the non-citizens into that play. The third is the citizens and non-citizens include differentiated social groups making rights claims. So citizens and non-citizens are not unified categories. They are not homogeneous categories. They are themselves divided within each category. So we have to pay attention to how those divisions work. And fourth, people perform or enact their citizenship by exercising, playing, claiming, and performing rights and responsibilities. People bring actively themselves into play of citizenship. So we have to understand also that performance aspect beyond performativity, but performance aspect of citizenship. And finally, the fifth one is when people perform citizenship, they creatively transform its meanings and functions. Playing citizenship, playing the game of citizenship is not about following a script, but in fact, creatively resignifying the script one which inherits. And I argue that all these senses are present when performative citizenship accomplishes its transformative possibilities. Now, what I'm going to do is to focus each of these five senses in a little bit more detail, and then I'll tell you the short story of then how the political theory professor was invited to play the game of an amateur curator. Now let's focus on the citizenship as a means of social struggle. What does that involve? Now, the first sense, as I mentioned, in which citizenship is performative concerns the issue of struggle. Although citizenship is often considered by conventional approaches a more or less stable membership of a state, particularly a nation state, a performative perspective considers citizenship as anything but stable. It is in fact unstable institution. Who may and may not act as a subject of rights is determined by ongoing political and social struggles over not only the content of rights, but also who are and who are not entitled to them. If performative citizenship is a struggle over the subjects of rights, this struggle creates a scene, a stage, in which social groups contest their similarities and differences, not constituted separately from this particular encounter, but through the struggle. So similarity, difference do not emerge independent from the specific content of its struggle. This argument assumes that a sociological proposition that any given political order, any given society, there's often a social group whose particular characteristics dominate as seemingly universal characteristics. If we recognize that since the 18th century, first in Euro-America and then across the world, the nation state became the dominant polity, we then acknowledge those who were disqualified as citizens, who were not qualified as citizens. To put it conversely, the particular characteristics of a narrow social group, such as being perceived as propertied, adult, male, ostensibly rational, white, Christian, heterosexual, and able-bodied became the dominant universal characteristics in the modern state. A narrow group was able to project its own particular characteristics as a play of domination as universal. These characteristics created various other subaltern social groups as subjects without rights. The poor, young, women, those who cannot practice their mental capacities, black, non-Christian, including Muslim, indigenous, Jewish, ethnicized minorities, queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people, disabled people, were deemed not capable of fulfilling the duties of citizenship and hence acting as responsible citizens. So already in the beginning of the Enlightenment, the content of citizenship is already divided across these citizens and non-citizens groups and the subalternity. It was only in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, that struggles of women, indigenous people, blacks, queers, started significantly to challenge this domination. The challenge of this domination is incredibly recent, historically speaking. These social struggles began unraveling the dominant characteristics of citizenship. This unraveling is still underway. We belong to an age when the dominant citizen subject and his, only later hers and theirs, characteristics are challenged, yet where the subject positions of its contestants remain as precarious as ever. Youth, children, disabled, Muslims, the poor, blacks, women, queer, you can expand the list, the indigenous people, in any combination of these, make right claims to the characteristics of citizenship so that they might cross from their precarious positions to at least more livable positions. And yet this struggle also produces its resistances. Farage, Trump, Brexit may remind you some of those struggles that are taking place about this core identity of the citizen who belongs to the nation state. It is that at stake with the current struggles. Second one, citizenships and its others. How does that operate? Now, the second sense in which citizenship is performative concerns how these social groups that I mentioned, struggling for rights, bring into play as both citizens and non-citizens. Now, social groups I mentioned don't struggle to become subjects of rights from identical positions. This is not an even playing field. They occupy different subject positions ranging from citizens as insiders to, think of it as a spectrum of differentiation and discrimination, to strangers, outsiders, and aliens. I've already suggested that citizens are those subjects whose entitlements or privileges are instituted as civil, political, and social rights, codifying the particular characteristics that identify the properly constituted dominant citizen. And often, strangers are those subjects who, while accepted into citizenship, are still considered strangers in the sense that they have not yet fulfilled requirements to act as citizens. Modern examples are women in the 19th century Britain, for example, and blacks in the 20th century America, as both social groups that were deemed strangers of citizenship because dominant social groups consider them as lacking capacities to act as citizens. Yet both women and later blacks, of course, were also understood as indispensable parts of the polity or the social order that fulfilled certain functions for it. Reproduction for women as mothers, labor for blacks as slaves first, and then as workers. By contrast, there are social groups who are deemed outsiders to citizenship, and they find themselves as migrants and refugees struggling for the even right to be present in a polity. So unlike strangers, their right to be present in a polity is questioned. The difference between strangers and outsiders is often contingent on disposability or deportability. Strangers are sometimes accepted as indispensable, yet corrigible, meaning subject of and to discipline. Whereas outsiders may sometimes become indispensable, yet incorrigible, meaning subject of but to punishment. Deportation is an example of that. Yet criminalization and imprisonment can also sometimes play on young black women, young black men, for example, such that they can straddle the positions of from stranger to outsider, from corrigibility to incorrigibility. In fact, straddling between these subject positions provides the dynamics of citizenship as play rather than a static institution, particularly a legal institution. Now, those deemed as aliens of a polity typically face total rejection of compatibility with or even respectability for acquiring or accessing citizenship. Categories of people such as enemy combatants or terrorists correspond to this irredeemable or rejected subjects, or Jews in 1930s Europe. Now, subject positions of citizens, strangers, outsiders, and aliens, I don't want to give the impression that they are either static or impermeable positions. They are playable positions. There's a huge variety of social groups that move through or across these positions. The boundaries between citizens, strangers, outsiders, and aliens are always contested and dynamic, permeable, precisely because they are also objects of these struggles. As I've said, people actually identify with or are ascribed to various social groups and simultaneously and constantly traverse subject positions from citizens to non-citizens. Moving across these positions or breaking down the boundaries between them involves political struggles. Now, governing ourselves as political subjects, considering this way of playing citizenship, often means exercising rights that we may have, and often also claiming rights that we may not have. It means also making claims for or against rights others do not have as members of multiple social groups. Through citizenship, we sort out or negotiate these differences and settle on certain conventions that remain relatively stable for a period of time, only to be destabilized again by those subjects who traverse positions and the boundaries by rejecting and resisting dominated positions that they find themselves. So far, I've discussed performative citizenship as though each polity develops its own distinct and independent conventions of performative citizenship. It obtains a particular model in France, particular model in Germany, particular model in the US, you might think, or it might give the impression. Yet many social groups, even those defined as nations, stretch across not only these social boundaries, but also borders of polities. The ways in which people act out performative citizenship traverse not only social groups within polities, but also across them. And we have to take into account of that crossing borders. This gives rise to numerous performative contradictions in citizenship. These partly arise from the fact that just as in relationship between citizens and non-citizens, there are asymmetrical power relations among different political orders. If indeed the sovereign state is the dominant polity of the modern age, we have to remember that it became dominant through a particular history involving Euro-American settler colonialism, imperialism, Orientalism, and nationalism. Euro-American empires such as Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, British, American, and German have left indelible marks on places they colonized through various governing strategies and technologies, and impose various citizenship arrangements on colonies. It is these arrangements that erased or displaced already existing relations between and amongst various social groups and replace them with forms of imperial citizenship. These indelible marks of colonialism have not only inscribed names such as the Americas, the Middle East, and other continents, but also inscribe certain forms of imperial citizenship in these places. Now, the third sense in which citizenship is performative is citizenship as multiplicities. The particular notion that I want to get across is the difference between the right to claim rights and making specific rights claims. Now, whether it's working across various polities, let's say crossing borders in the case of, for example, sans-papiers movement, refugees resistance movement, rights for migrants movements, not only it crosses borders, but also it crosses borders across subaltern groups, blackness, whiteness, queerness, straightness. It constantly destabilizes these boundaries and borders. Now, what happens in these struggles are we need to recognize two things. One, it constitutes people who have a right to make rights claims, regardless of the content of the claim. When, for example, queer people say that we ought to have a right to, whatever that right is, appear in public space, the right to appear in public spaces, to have access to same-sex marriage, however that right is articulated in specific content, beyond that content, it is also establishing a right that we have a right to do this. We have a right to articulate a right that we do not have. We have a right to articulate a right that does not yet exist. So the two forms of rights are not identical. Making right claims, for example, by voting against this or that party, against this cause or that cause, is a particular right that already exists for citizens. But for refugees to say that we have crossed the border, your legal regime constitutes as illegal aliens, but we want to constitute ourselves as people who have a right to do this, because it is your state that created the instability and war from where I'm coming from. That is creating a right that does not exist. So it is the first type of right. This is a significant distinction that we have to always keep in mind when rights are brought in performatively into existence. And citizenship as performance, for these to be done, the kinds of rights that need to be practiced, they have to stage acts, and they have to bring into play various conventions and break them. Without breaking a convention, it would be impossible to actually act as citizens. So dissidence, disobedience are fundamental elements of citizenship. They are not marginal, they are not peripheral element of citizenship. When some people do, when there is a possibility of dissidence. Dissidence is the fundamental core of citizenship, performative citizenship. And this dissidence can be articulated as I, we, they have a right to formulation. This is often what it does, performative citizenship. And then finally, citizenship is performative in a creative sense, in that people make themselves creatively as citizens by playing with scripts that handed down to them. So there's this dissident citizenship is not only dissidence for nothing, but it articulates certain principles of dissidence and disobedience. Aspiration, in a way, aspiration to citizenship, aspiration to play citizenship, aspiration to perform citizenship is simultaneously an aspiration to bring questions of equality, justice, liberty, emancipation, and solidarity into play. It is in this sense that it is creatively has to break conventions of domination. So I have been working along these lines, developing political theory of citizenship as performative citizenship over the last few years. And then I mentioned the transformation of a professor into a curator. How does this happen? As we develop this work, using the language of play, game, performance, bringing things into being that doesn't yet exist, and so on, beyond my intention, beyond my plans, I began to be approached by ethnographic museums, activist arts groups, galleries, curators, museum studies people, performance studies, theater studies, groups and people whom I did not have either a natural affinity or even working relationship. And I found myself doing various different things. For example, it started with Tate Modern Future Citizen project. Tate Modern approached me and said, would you be interested in curating or moderating a forum, a presence, a stage that we want to put together on future citizenship? I was, of course, nervous about entering into an area, an arena, as it were. Myself as a player, yes, I am speaking about playing citizenship, but what I perform is not necessarily citizenship. Of course, it is related, and it's not necessarily performance in that sense either. And then we did this Future Citizen project in Tate Modern, and then there is a development in London now, a Migration Museum project. And Migration Museum project also approached, we had discussions whether we could put together an exhibition not in Call Me By My Name, concerning stories from Calais and the questions of paperless people, the undocumented people, refugees, and their rights struggles. Can we, for example, do something that performs their rights together? And I was involved in that project. And now more recently, in being involved in these, I have also got to know a number of artists, activists whom I did not know, curators, museum studies people, theater studies, performance studies, and so on. And Tate Modern began a new initiative called Tate Exchange to be able to create a space for people who want to bring various sectors together. And we started a project, and now we're putting together something that we are refusing to call an exhibition, but a performance event in Tate Modern's new building, Switch House, the 5th floor, something called Who Are We? So what we're going to do in this project is we're going to create a scene in which anyone who comes in touch with that scene is going to have his, her identity troubled. That person is not going to be able to be comfortable in using the term we, for example, in an unproblematic way. So we're going to interrogate who are we. I can give examples from each of these and the particular political issues and so on it raises, all of which you are aware of. Many of the questions that you're raising in this conference relate to the problems that now I'm encountering in doing these projects. How do we create, for example, a space in which we can interrogate the we effect of calls? When people are called upon, interpolated into a particular we. We are British, we are white, we are American, we are left behind. What are these we's, and how do people actually performatively move into these, and how we can interrogate these particular moving into, and who's making the call, what plays of domination actually it enters into, are the questions that we are asking now. It is extraordinarily complex. It's up to 50 arts groups that I'm working with, and various art projects that they're approaching with. Our meetings typically last between 6 to 8 hours, and for a political theorist, even with a university post, 6 to 8 hour meeting is still a little too long. You can imagine. But all the issues that are raised, all the art projects that are being brought forward are, on the one hand, incredibly inspiring because in some ways, in each other's presence, we are performing citizenship. And some of these artists are themselves refugees, migrants, paperless, undocumented, documented. We come from variety backgrounds and trying to articulate what does it mean to create a space that is very much like a city space, a public space that calls citizens to play their citizenship performatively, and yet interrogates the question of who are we? I will stop there.